Welcome everyone. Welcome to the second edition of Open Salon, Open Austria's newest virtual and interactive format for discussion. We are your hosts, Martin and Clara, and we're very excited about so many people attending from all over the world to hear us discuss this interesting topic. So we thought about this Open Salon in the tradition of a classical Viennese literary salon that welcomes everyone to engage in a discussion about trending topics relevant to our society's current situation, while simultaneously opening up a dialogue about different things like technology, science, philosophy, art, and innovation as a whole. With every edition, we'll be hosting a different panel of experts and converse about a very specific issue. Especially in times of social isolation, Open Austria will continue to act as your conversational compass for explorers and pioneers.
Today's topic is Corona, we are watching you. Can AI and big data help us in our fight against the global pandemic without undermining our human rights and freedoms? Has the global pandemic changed our attitudes towards privacy and data protections as governments, private companies, and researchers and scientists enlist the help of AI and big data in the fight against Corona? Or is the price for using these tools too high? Are surveillance cameras, contact tracking apps, and big data threatening our liberties and human rights? We are very excited to talk about these issues with prominent experts in the field from literally around the globe and include your input and your own experiences into the discussion.
So we've structured this edition of the Salon around three main themes. Two to three panelists will be discussing a theme in around a 30-minute session. Our first session touches upon the topic of the global response to the Corona crisis. Afterwards, we'll be talking about tech applications to fight the crisis. And lastly, we'll talk about the global implications.
We want to make this Salon as interactive as possible. So please, if you have questions for your speakers, for any of our speakers, please use the Q&A section of Zoom and write down your questions. You can do this anonymously or with your actual name, and we'd be happy to read the questions to our guests. But first, we want to start with an anonymous survey where we want to know what you think of the different global approaches to the crisis when it comes to tech. And this is our first survey, which is, has the following question. In your personal opinion, which of the following countries strongly affected by COVID-19 have used technology effectively in the fight against the pandemic? There's multiple choices are possible, multiple answers, and of course the list of countries is by no means exhaustive. We just picked 10 where we thought COVID-19 is particularly virulent, and we thought the question is important, the question about tech or not. So we see that most of you are participating, very, very interesting. Again, the question is, which of the following countries strongly affected by COVID-19 have used technology effectively in the fight against the pandemic? And we're seeing most of you have already given us their...
Another second. Okay, maybe 10 more seconds. Last words coming in. We have the US, Austria, China, Italy, Russia, South Korea, Singapore, Sweden, Israel, and the UK. So, okie dokie. Let's end the survey. Okay. Okay, thank you so much for participating. Quite interesting results, don't you think, Martin? It clearly states that Asia is it's kind of doing a pretty good job here. Look at China, South Korea, obviously in the lead, followed by Singapore, Israel also doing strong. Okay.
Europe not doing so well.
I think it's fair to say that our participants think that. Well, in that, with that first survey, let's jump into our session number one, which is going to tackle the question of the global response to the crisis. And with that, I'd like to welcome our first speaker who's joining us actually from China. So I'd like to welcome Brian Tse. He's the Senior Advisor, Partnership on AI, as well as the Policy Affiliate with the University of Oxford Center for the Governance of AI. Hello, Brian.
Hi, Clara. Good to be here.
Well, it's such a pleasure to have you join us. Thank you so much. This is a real treat. So, Brian, in your particular situation, your life is about going back and forth from Oxford to the Bay Area to China. And last time we met at the Asia Society in San Francisco, you were actually on your way back to China, unsure of when you'll be able to return to Oxford or the Bay. So COVID-19 has famously originated in China. Therefore, you've also been ahead of the curve in fighting the crisis. And a recent study published in Science shows that how China has successfully managed to flatten the curve of the outbreak by implementing drastic control measures to substantially mitigate the spread of COVID-19. You've been back home since, what is it now, mid-March? And so we were wondering if you could give us your firsthand experience returning to China in the midst of the lockdown, and perhaps even walk us through your daily routine. How did those drastic control measures directly impact your life?
Okay, we're having a bit of a connectivity issue here. So I just wanted to mention again, while we try to have Brian reconnect, Brian is joining us from China. He was in San Francisco just a few moments ago, just a few weeks ago, and then went back via Hong Kong to China, mainland China, and is now joining us from there. But we have lost him, I think, due to connectivity issues. So maybe we will first start with our second guest. And our second guest is joining us, I think, from Europe. No, now here we have Brian back again. That's wonderful. Brian, can you hear us? We can see your screen here.
Mm-hmm. Well, it looks like this.
Brian, can you say something? We think you're here, but I don't know if we don't really hear you. Okay, I think we will go on to our next guest, Nicholas.
We'll circle back to you, Brian. Thank you.
We'll get back to Brian, but for now, we will have Nicholas Wright, who is a cybersecurity fellow for New America and a fellow at several US universities as well as in the UK. He's also a consultant for intelligent biology. So I'm very excited that he's joining us today, Nicholas from the UK. I hope we can have him here right now. Do we have Nicholas here?
Just a second. Yes.
So Nicholas, if you can hear us, I have a question to you. You recently published a piece in Foreign Affairs under the title Coronavirus and the Future of Surveillance, where you say that the world is seeing now two simultaneous disruptions that are shaping our history, or going to shape our history in the coming years. One is epidemiological, so it's about the coronavirus clearly, and the other is technological, and that disruption has been going on for a while. And now these two combine during our crisis. So what worries you about this crisis that combines those two disruptions? And what does it have to do with the use of AI and big data against corona?
Okay, so well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. So I think the first thing to remember about the COVID crisis is that it's a public health crisis. Okay, it's fundamentally, it's public health, right? I'm a medical doctor, and you know, when I went to medical school, the very first case you learn about in public health, it's the classic case, is a case that happened about a mile from my medical school in London, and it was about a pump So basically, there was a cholera outbreak in the 1850s, in 1854. Cholera killed tens of thousands of people over the preceding few years in a variety of outbreaks. And the very first case you learn about in public health is the cholera outbreak occurred, started on the 31st of August, 1854. And the doctor who got to grips with that outbreak, he walked around the local area, Soho in London, and he conducted surveillance, right? He identified exactly where the cases had occurred and why they had occurred. And then he discovered that, or he thought that the cases were clustered around a very specific water pump. And so what he did is that he went on the 7th of September, so 8 days on, he went to the local authorities and he said, take the handle off the pump of water. So people couldn't physically pump water from this water pump. Okay. And you got a massive reduction in the number of cholera cases, right? Now, we can have a whole discussion about that historical case and whatever, but the gist is that you have surveillance, you have data collection, you have detective work. I can't go into all the details of exactly what he did, but it's about surveillance and detective work. And then you typically get local authorities or similar or authorities to institute some kind of behavioral change, right? Now, that has been the case for the last 170 years since that occurred. And each generation uses a new type of technologies to do public health interventions, right? They use new surveillance technologies. So my grandfather was a public health physician at the main London airport in the 1950s and 60s. And smallpox cases used to come in, and he would scrape smallpox infected lesions or potentially smallpox infected lesions sent off for virology, right? And he would go and assess all the cases. This is what you do, right? This is just public health. So it is inevitable that now, just as we did with Ebola, right, we're going to use computational techniques, AI, whatever the current surveillance technology is, we will apply it to public health, because that's what we've done with every successive generation for the past 150 years since modern public health emerged, right? So it's not a question of if we will use surveillance in the coronavirus. It's not a question of if we will use the latest computational AI technologies. The question is not if, the question is how. Okay, so that's the very first thing.
So you're saying that surveillance is nothing new. It's in fact necessary and inevitable, and it's also been done for many, many decades. But you're saying in the article that there needs to be the right kind of surveillance.
Exactly.
Kind of, you call it democratic surveillance. What do you mean with that?
So now there has been a huge growth in the power of surveillance, for example, of all states, Austria, Britain, the United States, Sweden, over the past couple of 100 years. Enormous increase in the surveillance power of those states. But in some states, that has been kept under legitimate and more pluralistic and more democratic control. States like, for example, the UK, and the United States and Sweden, over the past 200 years, its surveillance powers have proliferated throughout the past 200 years, but the democracy has deepened actually pretty steadily over that same period. You can do powerful surveillance and have democratic control, but clearly we know that's not always the case, right? So clearly it can be used for authority control, and that's exactly what we're seeing being developed in China. So a completely separate, to be honest, a completely separate challenge is what's happening with China, where they are developing a digital authoritarian state with things like the social credit system, which uses extensive surveillance and digital technologies. And the problem is that unfortunately, as your poll indicated, right, we're all using surveillance. Successful surveillance at the moment for this public health crisis looks much more, success looks like what they're doing in East Asia. It looks much more intrusive. And as a consequence, what I really worry about is that we're going to end up with a world where the AI we're developing, which is going to be pervasive, in everybody's house from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to sleep, right? That's going to be, we're now going to be building that. This current crisis shifts us on a course where sadly we may well end up with much more intrusive surveillance than we would otherwise have done.
So that's kind of very interesting. You mentioned China, but then if we look at the global landscape, there are of course countries, and we saw it a little bit in the survey, where at least we have the impression, and they're not only in China. It's not just China. I would say it's Asia in general, where there is a much more positive attitude towards the use of technology in general, but maybe even specifically about AI and big data. We saw here South Korea, Singapore as well. Do you think that there is maybe just simply also a different approach in Asia towards technology, independently from whether it is about democracy or authoritarian systems?
That's a very good question. No, I don't know. Basically, no, I don't think so. I think it's also important to say here that I don't actually think the reason why East Asian countries have been more successful, the reason why South Korea has been more successful, is because they had a disastrous episode a few years ago with another set of infectious diseases, just as they did in other parts of East Asia, and so they built capabilities ahead of time, like, you know, a variety of negative pressure laboratories, and they had the ability to ramp up testing of tests for new viruses very rapidly. Right. I think that's actually why they've been successful, or that's most likely to be the case. It's probably not the intrusive surveillance they've done, but that's what we're seeing at the moment. That's what people are attributing their success to.
But if you when you started out said the surveillance is part of the game, and it's been part of the game since always. If you look at the different factors that are important for fighting the disease, let's say political leadership is often mentioned, and it differs from country to country. Then of course different policy responses and measures are important. And then of course different conditions and environments are important. Maybe even cultural values are important. It's interesting that there are countries in Europe where people interact far closer with each other, maybe in Southern Europe than in Northern Europe. So that's often cited. Then of course the age distribution is often cited. And then there's this use or not use of technology. How important do you think are surveillance, or simply in general, the use of technology, big data, NDI, how important is it in fighting the disease?
I think that in China, for example, I don't think that, so if you actually look at what they've done in Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea and China, so those are 5 East Asian countries where they have been successful. More successful so far than Western countries have at dealing with the COVID challenge. So across all of those countries, they're obviously all very technologically capable, but really I would say that it's in China that you have seen the use of mass surveillance most effectively. So actually what they've done in Singapore, for example, and what they've been doing in South Korea, they probably they could have done a lot of that without any sophisticated technology, to be honest with you. It was like employing, like in Singapore, it's employing the police and other people to do contact tracing. My grandfather did contact tracing in South London in the 1950s. It's not like, you know, you don't need AI to do that. But you need to have the capability to roll it out really quickly at scale, which is what we don't have in European countries, right? For a variety of political reasons, not because we're stupid, but simply because we didn't have epidemics within the last 20 or 30 years. People didn't want to spend all the money. If we'd been sitting here now, we could have had an open salon about chemical, biological or radiological problems, and they'd be saying, those idiots, they spent all their money preparing for pandemic flu. And we've had this radiological disaster that's like wafted across Europe or whatever. You can imagine the counterfactual. But in China, they really have, I think. Now, a lot of what done in China is more classic Leninist control systems they already had in place, with hundreds of thousands, millions of just peak human people doing local surveillance. But what they also did, for example, they could use every time you need to buy a rail ticket or an aircraft ticket within China, or you want to buy a mobile telephone, you have to use your government issued ID. So they can use that huge amounts of data from rail, airports, and mobile telephones to do basically semi-automated mass contact tracing. Now that I think is something that's different to anything we have done in Europe, and that also we would not want to do that in Europe, in my opinion.
Okay, maybe 2-3 questions from the audience. Please feel free to chime in, ask questions from Nicholas, and also Brian, can you hear us? Oh,
Hi, can anyone hear me?
Oh, excellent.
We can hear you, fantastic.
Oh, wonderful. Maybe this is a wonderful moment for you to respond to all those questions that that were actually directed to the both of you, but we weren't sure if you could hear us or respond to any of it. So
maybe Brian, maybe since you are in China, maybe before we jump into the debate of what Nicholas has said, can you give us a little bit of a flavor of what that means, surveillance in the fight against Corona in China or in other East Asian countries that you've been traveling recently to?
Absolutely. So since we met in San Francisco, I've been spending time in Hong Kong and Beijing, and I only came to Beijing 10 days ago, which is where I live. And upon landing at the airport, I went through a couple of hours of temperature measurements, questionnaires, and check-in with medical staff. And I think during those 2 hours, my temperature was measured for about 5 times, mostly manually by medical professionals rather than the fancy intelligence service robots that you might see on the news. Then I was transported to a mandated quarantine facility, which sounds bad, but it's actually kind of a 5-star hotel at the outskirts of Beijing for 14 days. And to get into the hotel, I basically had to pull out my mobile phone and install an app that is being developed by either Alibaba or Tencent. And then I will use that app to scan a QR code for filling up some of my personal and health information in order to get kind of the stamp approval from the hotel and the medical staffer. And this applies to domestic citizens and foreigners, young and old. You just have to go through this procedure, and you can't do that without a mobile phone or a WeChat account. And then in the past 10 days, I have basically been, staying within a room, not being able to go anywhere else as enforced by the policy. And every day I would receive a kind of daily phone call from a hotel staff, inquiring my health conditions and temperature. And based on this experience and my other observations, I basically have 3 points to make, and I'm happy to go into a bit more detail later in the conversation. One is that, there are machine learning research and development that sound very fancy and, happening at all the top AI companies and universities. But all these applications and research are enabled by much more labor-intensive, old school, and as Nicholas was pointing out, kind of Leninist classical method of collecting data. Even when you have all these big data platforms and intelligence service robots, they can't really analyze patterns if there are no local government officials setting up WeChat groups to collect social information, or having hotel staff calling you every day during your quarantine weeks in different cities. So that's point one. Point two is that China is often perceived as a data monolith with a central system collecting all the information from across the country, and that all companies have to comply with the system. But the reality is actually much messier. There are pushbacks from tech companies and consumers. There are significant technical barriers to aggregate these data. Often, these systems are not well maintained, and I had this just personal experience of filling out the same set of information again and again, from the airport to the hotel and to receiving phone calls. And then the third point that I want to make is that I think at times of emergency, there is a reasonable conversation to be had about negotiating between individual civil liberties and collective security and welfare. But I also think that we need to ensure that there would not be mission creep or surveillance creep in extending the surveillance system post-crisis. There was this large-scale system in China, which is called health code, that allows governments and companies to have real-time screening across the entire country. And that was very effective in containing the second wave of the virus. And that was fine and accepted by many citizens in terms of the need for rolling out such a system at scale. But then there are also concerns that governments are making plans to make use of the system in the future. And I think that's an important conversation for us to have.
In times of emergency, civil liberties don't have the same status as in normal times, but we need to be careful of a mission creep. What do you say to that, Nicholas? I mean, obviously, I come from Austria. Austrian government was one of the first imposing very strict measures that, for example, restrict the right to assemble, and many other rights, and largely supported by the population. Do you think that there is this danger of mission creep also in democracies?
I think the first thing to say is we've already, within the last 20 years, we've seen mission creep. I mean, after 9/11, there was massive mission creep. So, obviously, and it is extreme. I think another really important thing to remember is, so within the next, so we've got COVID-19 now. If you'd asked me 6 months ago, what's the pandemic people are going to be worried about? I would have said flu, pandemic flu, because that's what everyone's worried about. Now, COVID-19 isn't flu. And in 12 months, when we're potentially out of this COVID-19 thing, 18 months from now, whatever it will be, people will say, we're still waiting for pandemic flu that could happen in 2024. That's totally plausible, and it could kill tens of millions of people. So they're going to say, we have to do new stuff to prepare for pandemic flu. And they're not wrong, actually. Clearly, they're not wrong. So there definitely can be mission creep, but I think it's really important as to where that's going to matter. So I don't think it's going to matter so much in robust democracies, and I actually don't think it's going to matter so much in somewhere like China, because, China has got a clear political model. The United States has got a clear political model. Britain also has got a clear political model, and we've had our political models. They're robust and they've been around some time. The place where it's more dangerous is in more fragile democracies, where you're building the sinews of an authoritarian state, and you're channeling those societies towards more authoritarian modes of government. I don't think Austria is going to turn into a dictatorship because of COVID. That's totally implausible to me. But that's not the case for a wide variety of other countries, including those not that far from Austria.
Maybe we can also turn to another issue, because we wanted to start out with the kind of the international picture, and you now mentioned the geopolitical dimension of the crisis. One of the things that in the public's perception, and frankly also in my perception, that didn't work very well at the beginning in particular, was international collaboration. It seems like every country is on its own in this crisis. Borders are going up everywhere, even between and among friends and allies. And I'm talking here and thinking in particular, the response of the European Union at the beginning was really every country doing its own measures. And this has changed now quite a bit, I have to say. But the question is international collaboration as it has to be because of the nature of the epidemic, or can it be improved? And if yes, how should it be like? And I'm asking this question to both of you. Want to start with Brian?
Yeah, for sure. I think we can first kind of take stock of what have happened in the past few months with the U.S.-China relations. I think there are these biggest points of conflict, including, U.S. accusing China of not responding to a virus fast enough, and then on the other hand, China kind of accusing that U.S. is calling the virus, Wuhan virus and politicizing the events. And it seems like what is happening is that there is a scapegoating between countries where whenever there are domestic governance issues, the politicians and relevant policymakers want to divert the public attention to international pressure. And so if we look at the international situation from this psychological lens, what we need to know is whether there are other levers and forces that are much more rational and balanced in how they view our collective crisis. And I personally think that there are many efforts to be made on scientific cooperation, on business cooperation, as well as philanthropic cooperation. And if we focus on China-Europe relations for a little bit, I think that the Chinese policy towards Europe has been quite stable. At the beginning of the crisis, China kind of expressed appreciation to European countries for their donations and later showed a willingness to cooperate with Europe. Now, it's not that there are no sources of conflict between China and Europe. The well-publicized donations and assistance to EU members are seen by a lot of European countries as a propaganda campaign that aims to divide the EU from within. And then there are also a lot of articles suggesting that medical equipment imported from China are of bad quality. But I think it's important to differentiate whether there are campaigns that are ultimately political and whether there are efforts that are humanitarian in nature. Maybe it's hard to divide the line in some cases, but I think we, as a global community, need to try making that distinction as much as possible.
Nicholas, would you like to react to that? So there's this issue, of course, humanitarian help and collaboration versus politicizing those relations and those help efforts. That's certainly.
I think both of those things are utterly inevitable. I think it's impossible that they won't occur. If it hadn't been COVID, it would be something else. If AI hadn't advanced in the last few years, there would still be US-China competition, right? US-China competition really has very little to do with either of those things. Clearly, they affect the flavor or the character of that competition, but it's not the basis for that competition. So the basis of the US-China competition is that the US is still the #1 global power. China is not a superpower yet, although China is clearly growing very rapidly in a wide variety of different ways, economically, politically, and militarily. And the US is not enormously keen on that. And that is a source of enormous tension between the two of them. Now, COVID has nothing this was going to happen, almost certainly whatever happened. So the other thing to say, which is really critical, is that China and the US have fundamentally different political systems, types of domestic political regime. China is an authoritarian state, and the United States is a liberal democracy. Now, we can have a whole discussion about the complexities of that, but that's the gist of the thing. And the mere fact is that a world that is safe for the US, in which everyone's a democracy and everyone's happy, fundamentally doesn't involve an authoritarian superpower, and vice versa, right? China being China threatens the US being the US threatens China, right? And COVID and AI flavor that, and they have very important impacts on that, but they're not the basic tension.
One last question, and then we need to move on. The WHO is the one organization that's been tasked with coordinating the international response. Has come under a lot of criticism by the US, but not only by the US, also other countries voiced their criticism. Is it the right body? Does it need to be reformed in order to tackle future diseases? Brian?
Martin, can I actually take a second to respond to what Nicholas said, because I think
Sure.
it's an important one, and I could, make a connection between this point and your question. I think that if we look at the Cold War history, it was clear that there were adversarial dynamics between the U.S. and Soviet Union, but there was also scientific cooperation on arms control and a whole wide variety of issues that require scientists to visit laboratories of each other countries and basically come together at conferences like Hogwarts Conference on International Affairs. And I think the idea is that, yes, you can have competition between ideologies. The Soviet system and the American systems are fundamentally different, but then there are also a lot of common interests at stake, and it was the potential risk of nuclear war that brought some of the scientists together. And I think in the case of China and US, the differences between the two countries are actually smaller than what you saw during the Cold War history. And the potential catastrophes that the two countries face together are potentially much greater. We don't have to talk about climate change and nuclear risk. Now we can talk about pandemic preparedness, which is clearly a challenge that the international committee has to come together. And I think this relates to what I think is a really important conversation to have regarding the role of WHO. Again, the partnership between China and WHO has been severely politicized. I view a lot of the work at international organizations as kind of a fact-checking, third-party auditing responsibility, where their job is to make sure that we get all the facts and provide policymakers with the right tools and kind of historical experiences to be able to do that job. But I think that what we're seeing now is a failure for countries to appreciate that basic fact of why we need international institutions like WHO. So I would be curious if Nicholas has any thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean,
maybe, sorry, Nicholas, keep it really short. We've already overextended the first session. Sorry, I know this is a really interesting
Very
thought.
short. Obviously, the WHO is dreadful. It's awful. There are plenty of problems with it. But if it didn't exist, we would have to invent it, and then people would say it's amazing. How did we get this incredible organization? It's such an advance on not having it. So yeah, it's awful, but it's also really great.
Wonderful. To end on this note, I can say thank you so much, Nicholas and Brian, for joining us today, and this afternoon, wherever you are. We'll continue with a quick survey. So our second survey today is about, okay. So, just a second, let's go to survey number 2. Very quick one. Would you personally use a contact tracing app in the fight against COVID-19? So the answer is pretty binary, either a yes or a no. Feel free to answer now. We'll give it a minute. And then we'll welcome our panelists for the second session, which is on technical application against the fight of COVID-19. Let's see. All right. Okay. All right. Okay, so the results are in. And it's pretty clear that, well, it's not so clear, but I think slightly clear that most people would actually say yes to this question. Wonderful start for our session 2. And I would like to welcome our first speaker, Michael Schick. So, welcome, Michael. Michael is a co-founder of Invenium Data Insights GmbH, as well as a deputy head at the Institute of Transportation at the Technical University in Graz in Austria. So, hi, Michael.
Hi.
Good to have you here from Austria. Thanks for joining. Let me just quickly summarize what your tool is all about. So you're using anonymized location data from Austrian data provider A1. And at this point, what you have are locations, right, from people. And you're trying to trace hotspots where the virus is most likely to spread. So it's like you're tracing mobility. And the data makes it possible to map concentrations and movements of customers in, so to speak, hot zones where COVID-19 has taken hold. So my question for you to start this off is, you've strongly emphasized that your tool is compliant with the EU privacy rulebook, the GDPR, which restricts the processing of sensitive personal data without its owner's explicit consent. So let me ask you this, before you get the anonymized data, what happened with it? I'm really curious, and I think our audience is too. Perhaps you could walk us through the process of the data acquisition and how exactly it is going to be used, or it is being used by the Austrian government.
Oh yeah, thank you for the invitation and greetings from Austria here. So I think I have to go a little bit in the history, how we started with doing this analytics based on movement analytics. I'm a transportation engineer, so I came from the area of transportation modeling, and I went 2012, so 8 years ago, to A1, to the telco, to the biggest, one of the biggest telcos in Europe already. And I said, okay, is there a possibility to use movement data, anonymized movement data of devices, of mobile phone devices? We are not analyzing people, we are analyzing devices, and then we are extrapolating on people. This is a typical difference. And I said, then, is there a possibility to get your data based on your monitoring system? Because every telco has a monitoring system to analyze how many devices are logged in on a base station, for example. They have to know it. This is already by law defined. They have to know it. Is the infrastructure okay? How many devices are logged in? Is the signal strength? Everything works, for example, from their side. And I went to them and said, okay, is it a possibility to get this data to calibrate our traditional transport models? And traditional transport models means we're analyzing the traffic demand of people. Which traffic demand do they have? And for example, to get for the future new possibilities to build new infrastructure and so on. And from years ago, this was done by surveys, household surveys, and so on. And we said, okay, is there a possibility to get this new data to digitalize the possibility of mobility surveys and so on? And then we started 5 years long with different research projects in Austria. And one of the research projects already included to see, is it possible to use this data from telcos, this monitoring location data, in one way for the scientific area, for the research area, where I was at the university, I'm already in university there, and also, for example, for the commercial way. We did this together with the University in Vienna here, with the guys from the law center, and we looked, okay, is it possible to use this data? And what is this data? For example, a monitoring system works like this. You have a device and there is a base station. And always what they are doing, they're analyzing how far away, for example, is this device from the base station. Always the thing from the people is, this is like a GPS tracking app. You have to know this is for 5 centimeters on this side or 5 centimeters on this side. No, this monitoring system for a telco is only in this way. Is there a possibility that the device is here? But this accuracy must not be so high. So the accuracy, for example, is in urban areas between 0 and 200, 300, 400 meters away from the space station. There could be an accurate this time. And also, for example, in some rural area in Austria, there could be an accuracy of, or the distance could be between 500 meter and 1000 meter, but also 10 kilometers away from the real point where the device is. And we said, okay, this is, for us, it's okay, because we are looking only on movements of devices, in the next way of movement of people, maybe also in a possibility of which transport mode they are, for example, using, but only in a macroscopic way. So we're only analyzing if they are using, or if they are traveling, for example, from this municipality to another municipality. We're not analyzing people, okay, they are using, for example, this street, they are using this link on a graph and so on. This is what we are doing and what we are analyzing here. And this is also here. So we'll see a base station, this base station are together for some cell sites in this area. And we are looking, okay, are people or devices are moving over the day from one cell area to another cell area.
Okay.
And what we were then doing, for example, here for the Austrian government, 6 weeks ago, we said, okay, we're doing this quite good. We're doing this in a lot of projects in Austria, all the moving projects and so on. And then we said, okay, they always said they have epidemiological models, and there is the impact. How is the social distancing factor calculated? And we said, okay, this could be a possibility from our side using the mobility factor, because we know from the analytics we're doing, around about 27% of the people are staying at home. And for example, the other people have this trip distance during the day. How many people have some mobility? How long is the mobility? How is the trip distribution and so on? And then we said, okay, we can give the modelers from the epidemiological models this information, because we have this monitoring. We can build this monitoring, for example, for every day, for every municipality in Austria, and give them a real impact factor based on this mobility index. And then we said, okay, let's do this. This was the Friday before the lockdown came. Saturday, we sat together with A1, because A1 is also one of the shareholders of Invenium. Is there a possibility to give this information to the government? They said, okay, would be nice. And then we said, okay, we will build this dashboard, which is already here. We will calculate every day a mobility factor, how many people are moving, how many people are staying at home, to give this mobility index as a factor, as a monitoring factor. On the one hand side, okay, how this lockdown works in Austria, but from our side, it was more important to give the information to the other modelers from other universities to have a real monitoring index. Does this lockdown, for example, from the one side, reduces the mobility, and the reduction of the mobility also reduces this social contacting. This was the idea why we're doing this.
Excellent. So quick follow-up question, very short. That mobility factor, what kind of real tangible impact did it have? You've been able to monitor this over the last month, right?
Yeah. So the mobility really was, it was very impressive also for us when in Austria it started now around about 5 weeks ago. And we had before the general mobility, 27% of our people are staying at home. The other people are moving. They are doing all the things. They do their activities. They work to the home at home. They're working. They're going to school and so on. And then we had on the weekend this lockdown, and there was roundabout, we had on the first weekend from 27% up to 70% are people staying at home, really, because you need one people, or some people are, you have to go to, I don't know, to shops to buy something, some infrastructure and so on. And this was really around about 40% increased really this stationary segments, which were analyzed from our side to stay at home. This was very impressive. Okay. And what was more impressive,
to sum it up so it basically showed that the lockdown worked in Austria. Yeah. So people are very compliant, and that furthermore really served the government in their mission. I'm sorry that we have to take in our next speaker just to stay on schedule. So we're very pleased to welcome Andrew Smart. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Andy. I think we can hear you now very well.
Right.
Andy, you're a machine learning researcher at Google Research, and we just heard now a very interesting use case from Austria in collaboration with the Austrian government. What can you tell us about Google's efforts? The news lately in the last days talked a lot about this upcoming cooperation between Google and Apple, kind of historic rivals working together in the midst of the crisis. What is Google actually doing, one of the big tech giants, in the fight against Corona and using big data and AI?
I'll caveat this that I'm, not speaking for Google here. I'm here in a personal capacity, and I'm a researcher, and so I haven't been directly involved in the Google-Apple collaboration, but I can say from, I think that collaboration happened quite quickly when this became apparent how severe this crisis was, and there wasn't, there have been efforts in historically to work together, I know of, and I think this was finally the catalyst that said, okay, we put aside kind of our differences and really get busy on doing this. And I think probably the primary motivation was just the scale of, I think most mobile devices in the world are either Android or Apple. So the enormous scale at which these two companies can cover was a motivation. And basically right now what they have is an interoperable API, so an application programming interface that would allow health authorities or developers to easier implement contact tracing applications. And I know that they're planning more of a direct embedding of a Bluetooth functionality in Android and iOS that would be more automated, and that would you would not need to do your own app, but then you could, health authorities could access this off the devices. And I think one of the other motivations for this was to really try to avoid using location data, and just to preserve privacy. And I know that this system, I'm not super well versed on the technical details, but I know that it works via keys. So it exchanges very much like PGP keys in the background. So none of, Google or Apple would never see PII on any of the servers. They could not technically discover this, and it would only be through cooperation with health authorities that kind of information would be available. And to protect, this would always be, of course, opt-in for people, and the voluntariness and the consent was a very important thing. And I know another key aspect is like the speakers before had mentioned, this mission creep. And if you enable this sort of massive system of like being able to tell who's close to whom at various times, you have to be able to turn it off when it's no longer needed. I do agree with the risks that, various states using this for different purposes is
we'll get into that in a second.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's of course a very hot topic. Yeah. But let me start by welcoming our third speaker for this session. So, no, this one. Hello? Nope. Just a second. Martin? Perfect, here we go. Paul, can you hear us?
Yes, hey, how are you?
Excellent, we can't see you. This is odd. Have you turned off? Oh, no?
There we are.
Yeah, here we go, excellent. Always those tiny little hiccups. Well, Paul McLachlan, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Paul is the head of data science at the Ericsson Global Artificial Intelligence Accelerator. So, Paul, thank you for joining us. I'd like to jump right into a very pressing issue here, and very interesting challenge that has been actually launched by the White House Office of Science and Technology policy on March 16. It's called the COVID-19 Open Research Data Set Challenge, short CORD-19. And Ericsson responded to the call of action almost immediately. And it has created an information retrieval tool that is sourcing tens of thousands of academic research papers about COVID-19. And you've allocated almost 400 data scientists from Ericsson to join the challenge of sourcing and building crucial data sets, and it's successful, that would help doctors and public health practitioners to access critical information. So maybe for us and for our audience, what does it mean and how does it work?
Yeah, for sure. So thanks so much for having me, first of all. So Ericsson is the world's leading telecommunications company. So I think it's important, and it's very fascinating to be part of this panel because Ericsson builds, operates, installs all of the mobile networks we use around the world. So A1 in Austria and Telekom Austria, for example, are our customers. And so a lot of the data from the first panelists are coming from cell phone towers or installed, designed, and built by Ericsson. So it's a really nice through line. But we are, of course, a company with 100,000 employees and 180 companies. So we have, been very alarmed about COVID-19. We have seen it impact our operations, our data, and some of our staff. So everywhere from our senior leadership, our CEO on down has really cleared all of the barriers to working on this. So we had the opportunity to respond to a number of data challenges. We've actually built quite a large number of data science teams throughout Ericsson around the world. And so this challenge that you're kind enough to bring up is really around trying to build models that allow us to find answers to questions inside of academic papers. And this can be actually pretty tricky because there's so much papers that are being published on this topic every day. We see about 3,000 to 4,000 being published every day currently. And so just trying to stay on top of the latest developments for a researcher is nearly impossible. So we worked with the White House, and we can also make this tool available to any other government that's interested. We've now published it publicly and made it available open source, so it's available for anyone to use. We'd be happy to work with anyone on this call on either level to help them use this tool, but really around trying to make the insights from these recently published medical papers accessible and for people to be able to answer specific questions, everywhere from, what is the economic impact of school closures down to what should we look for in terms of genome sequencing mutations. So we actually just published a white paper for a telecommunications company yesterday on genome sequencing mutations, which is pretty cool.
Well, this sounds fascinating. But in reality, you're sourcing this avalanche of material that could help doctors. How do they actually get the information? Like, how do you distill the necessary information for a medical practitioner that might have not read an academic paper in ages?
Yeah, so
how do they get the information?
Yeah, so that's a little bit above what our pay grade and what we were trying to do. So what we're thinking of is really making this tool accessible to governments, to universities, to health departments and the like. And then they'll of course have their own channels to reach out to doctors. And
okay, so there's an additional link.
Exactly,
okay.
Yeah. So, and what's great about this is because we did this in participation with the White House. So hopefully that they have a plan in place. One hopes to make this information accessible, but particularly for countries such as Austria. We're a Swedish company, of course, so we have see Austria very much as a European partner. But for any other country that's interested, we of course can make it accessible, and it's also language agnostic, so it would work as well in German as it does in English or Swedish or any other language you might choose.
Okay, so thank you so much. Now that we know your backgrounds and what you're working on, I'd like to open the discussion to the three of you. Let's talk about machine learning and big data in this COVID crisis. So it's this technology is being used around the world in a variety of applications to help fight the pandemic. Some of the applications are quarantine enforcement, contact tracing that we've already touched upon, flow modeling, pharmaceutic development, social graph making, and many more. So maybe you could give us in very few words your opinion on what is the potential and what are the limitations of these applications. Let's start with Andy.
Sure. I think fundamentally, as people have mentioned, the strength of a machine learning model is limited by the data, and that's the key. And I think some of the earlier speakers talked about this kind of laborious manual data collection that's necessary, and to know that you have quality data that actually measures what the construct or the phenomenon that you think you're trying to predict, and that you have really valid ways of verifying that this data is meaningful. And I would point to even the giant models that we have at Google still require massive amounts of human labeling and annotation, and that's kind of invisible manual labor that still goes on in AI. And there's a joke or a meme that goes around that AI is really just millions of people like labeling images of cats. And I do think there's, in terms of these massive, finding patterns is something that AI is really good at. And DeepMind is working on these protein folding things that are, these problems that are extremely difficult for humans to do or impossible. So I do think there's an opportunity, to really try to focus and try to use the strengths of machine learning for what it's good for. I think the danger might be in this over application situation that you see very often, where we have all these fancy models, we have tons of data, we got to do something with it, and then you end up with predictions that are not that harm people actually in the long run, or that don't predict what you think you're predicting. So I think very careful consideration, both of the data collection process and then also the use cases. Like, is this really a machine learning problem? First and foremost, I would.
Yeah, that's a very interesting approach. And also, you've touched upon data quality. You've also touched upon the problem of the creating a false sense of security with implementing all those applications. So I'd like to ask Paul, we talked about this previously already. Maybe you have some thoughts on that?
I thought it was a really nice key off. I think Mikhail also brought up questions around data quality in terms of precision of location data. So we at Ericsson, the data that is actually coming from A1 is actually coming from our network. So we have a lot of experience working with location data. And one of the things I checked was, so we actually have a startup unit inside of Ericsson that is focused on activating and monetizing mobile operator data. So primarily at Ericsson, we use location data only for purposes of network diagnostics and performance. So we don't think about it at all, but and it's fully anonymized. So we actually have no way to understand who owns a device. It's actually the mobile operator who knows that. So we at Ericsson but have no way to know that any particular device, who owns it and like. So for us, our data is fully anonymized. But the challenge is really around the precision. So right now, what being recommended is to stay 2 meters apart from people. And so that's where we think that the infection zone is. But using mobile location data, we've done some studies. We find that 70% of it across the ecosystem is not valid within a mile. So in terms of contact tracing, i.e. knowing who you've come in touch with, it's maybe a bit questionable how valuable mobile location data is for that endeavor, because knowing people came within a mile of one another, if you're in the center of San Francisco or in the center of Vienna, that means you're within a mile of probably 500,000 people. It's not very valuable information to know that, and it's actually probably create more panic if you've got a text message every morning that you have been within a mile or within 1.6 kilometers of 200,000 people, one of 10,000 of whom might have tested positive. I don't think that's very valuable. But what mobile location data can really give is a sense of trends, of compliance, of hotspots, which I think what's really great about Mikhail's, what he's working on. But what we are also doing at Ericsson, because we have a tremendous amount of experience working with this type of data, and we have a number of Ericsson Moto, which has a number of business initiatives, has also created a tool that we're also working, we actually will be working with the American government around, the government of California, but we could also presumably make it available pending data availability, or we take all of our learnings around things like angles of where towers are pointed, particular heights of cell phone towers, the actual radio equipment itself, which can actually really refine the precision down to a much more reasonable amount, a much more informative amount. So that's something that we are working on at Ericsson.
Perfect. And Michael, I mean,
yeah, I agree to both guys what they said before, and I'd like to add. This is what it's always important. Also, we use a lot of machine learning algorithms and so on. It's always important what is your training data and how valid is your training data, and you have to know what should be the outcome of the topic, and how does the calibration work, and also how the validation work. I think this is the most important part. So we're really focusing on the mobility analytics, where we are quite good, and we do this since 8 years in this case with the data is getting better and so on. And we are not focusing on some use case which we are not really good. So we said, okay, we can do this. The results are quite valid what we are doing. The data is quite valid. The annotation before is good. The database is good. And then you can do things, and the results are quite in a good quality, quantity and quality, and that's always important. And what I see now is that a lot of different people from different areas working on this topic, and you have to think, okay, if the input is from their side quite in this percentage that the quality is getting higher, okay, or it is not possible. So you have always to look which guys are working on which problem. This is from my side what I'd give to an impact here.
Okay, well, that actually leads me to my second question. Thank you for laying it out so clearly. So let's talk about contact tracing apps, because I think they're kind of on everyone's mind in the fight of the pandemic. First of all, an important thought in this is the virus doesn't know borders, right? So the European Commission has actually called on member states to build an interoperable system of voluntary apps that use short-range radio waves to measure users' proximity to one another, rather than tracking their phone's physical locations, such as GPS, right? So it's a tool that's quite similar to what Andy has been talking about, the collaboration between Google and Apple using Bluetooth. So maybe let's talk about this just for our audience, the pros and cons of Bluetooth versus location data. What are the advantages and disadvantages in the fight against the pandemic? And let's tackle the question of, does a contact tracing app actually mean anything if it's not a transnational effort, or at least a trans-state effort here, in the case of the United States. So instead of having a patchwork of different apps, how can we collaborate to really share data so that this makes an actual difference, which is going to be quite pressing here in the US. Volunteers, who starts?
I can maybe take a stab. I think what has been really interesting is some of the ideas around using different types of radio frequencies to locate devices. So for example, in France, you're not allowed to move within a kilometer of your home. So if you want to exercise, you have to stay within a kilometer of your home. But as Michael pointed out, we actually, using most mobile data, particularly in rural areas, can't tell if you are within a kilometer of your home. It's about plus or minus 15 kilometers. So that was the idea to move to shortwave and other types of devices. So we don't need to rely on mobile networks, we'll use other technology. The challenge with that from a human rights perspective is your phone is not designed to transmit that data back and forth unless you leave it unlocked. And that actually has legal implications in terms of searches. So for example, if your phone is unlocked and you are arrested, police can actually, for example, look at the content of your phone, at least in the United States. I can't speak for Europe. So that actually starts to be a question around whether or not you're actually abridging other constitutionally protected rights like privacy if you have to leave your phone unlocked all the time for that technology to work. And then people start to get concerned around that, then I think that the percentage of people using that technology will be relatively low. And therefore the value of that data will also be relatively low.
Precisely, the question of you don't have enough quantity, actually you don't have, so that decreases the quality, exactly. Okay, anyone else?
Yeah.
Sorry, Paul, finish your thought.
I was going to say, so I think the issue here is it has to be both the technology and policy response. So I think talking about one without the other is actually a bit counterproductive in the sense that you can come up with technological solutions, but it also requires, for example, potential temporary legal changes as well.
Maybe I can chime in here and throw in two questions related
Just
to
a second. I'd like to let Michael and Andrew take maybe answer that one, and then we can go to the audience question. Because I'm really curious to see big tech's response to this, and also maybe a startup in Austria. And of course, these innovation has to go hand in hand with policy responses, which luckily will be the third session of this webinar. So we'll tackle that question of the coordinated response in a second. So Andrew, Michael, do you have a comment on the last question?
I mean, I know from my own perspective, and from talking to people inside Google, there's a tension definitely with what role does Google or Apple, what role does big tech have to play in this, given that the sort of disproportionate size of the networks and the network effects and things like that, where conceivably you could have a large positive impact, but we're not a public authority. We're not, it's still a private company. And so we don't have democratic oversight over our decisions or our policies. And of course, there's an interest to do something positive and cooperate and collaborate, but in the absence of like a sort of well-functioning public health authority, for example, in the US, which is, kind of been dismantled and stuff, there's a need to, I feel, step in a way, but that's fraught with lots of things that we're still a private company. So I think the fundamental tension is for the people or the tech companies is like that, stepping into these roles that you would hope a public health authority could do.
Yeah.
And this trust issue. So
yeah, the trust issue. We'll talk about this in session 3. Thank you so much for bringing it up, Michael. Some final words on that question.
The trust issue is the most important part. So we have since 3 or 4 weeks in Austria also the discussion with the Stop Corona app and so on. Who will go into it? Who will use it? And it's not really, you cannot do it. For example, we already discussed it. Is it a possibility to use such an application for the whole European Union, for example? Is this a possibility? And from my side, I think it's really very complicated in Europe to have like a holistic approach for every country, that they will do it together and the people then will use it. And I think we will see. I think from my perspective of an engineer, I think it's quite an interesting way. But from the other side, it's always this trust and data privacy topic, which is from both sides to see. Very interesting, technical way, ethical way, you have to discuss it. And this is a long discussion, and we already like to discuss in Europe. We already know this. And so we will see what will happen in the next week. I'm waiting for which way we'll go.
Excellent. Okay, maybe Martin?
We have two questions from our participants related to contact tracing, very precise. One is, should they be mandatory or should they be voluntary? And the other one is, once the crisis is over, how does one get rid of them? How does one get rid of the apps? Is there a way to shut them off? And yeah, those are the two questions.
Who's the first?
I mean, you know, of course, I don't. There's and again, not speaking for Google, but I mean, I don't. You know, Google's not in a position to. I feel like that's a political policy epidemiological question about the mandatory. Like, Google can only enable things or disable things. I feel like, but that would definitely be a. I personally would not want Google making that decision.
Yes, I think that's a very smart answer, and we'll also talk about this in session 3, how to reverse some of the applications that have to be rolled out during the pandemic. Michael, Paul, one quick answer to one of those questions?
I think that the way to at least answer the second question is, how do you close the data? I can't speak for any specific app that's been created, but data privacy is something we take really seriously at Ericsson, something I also personally take seriously. Even in the past year, we filed a huge number of privacy-related patents. So I think the thing to do is to make sure that there isn't a direct link either to the mobile account or to the individual citizen identity, but there is some way to come back. So that if you have that two-way mapping, you can actually destroy one end of it, and then the data is no longer valuable. But I would not recommend storing the data against any, individual, individually attributable marker, like a personally identifiable name or, citizenship number or tax filing number, but somewhere where that link can be broken when it's no longer needed.
Right. Well, Michael?
No, it's okay. For me, it's the same topic. If what will be done with the data in the future, and is this data for the individual person? This would I think it's not really a good way. So you have to know what will be done in the data with the data in the future. Then the decision is easier, I would say.
Excellent.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful. I think we've got a very clear picture of some of the applications, and we immediately entered into a discussion on the implications already with you guys, and that is a good way to turn to our last session. So thank you very much, Michael, and good night to Vienna. Thank you very much, Andy and Paul, who are based here in the Bay Area. And we would like to start our last sessions, which is about the implications. We want to really turn to the issues, to the rights, to the civil liberties. And we want to start this with a question, our last survey to you. And the question we want to ask there is, what do you believe that some big data and machine learning applications that are being used to fight the pandemic violate your civil rights? So it's about your sense of whether applications that are already used now are fighting your rights, your civil liberties, whether it's privacy or whether it is any of the other civil liberties potentially affected. Do you believe that you are already at this moment being affected and your civil rights are being violated? We have 4 different answers, as you've realized. Yes, but I'm willing to pay that price. No, I don't know. Since we have a big Silicon Valley and tech-savvy community, the I don't know it doesn't receive a lot of attention here, but I think we're kind of done with the survey. Let's go to the results.
Yes, so most of our audience seems to agree that yes, there are some dangers to applying big data and machine learning in the fight against the pandemic, and we'll tackle that question and that problem in our session 3. So,
there we would like to welcome our guest, our first guest in this last session, Eileen Donahoe. She's the Executive Director of the Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford University. We've worked with her extensively in the past on those issues: human rights, technology, tech diplomacy. Eileen, what do you say to this survey where we asked people? So where people are kind of divided between yes and yes, but I don't care.
So thanks for that question. Great conversation. I would have posed the question differently. It was almost a little too binary. I wouldn't have called it, do you think that your rights are being violated? Do you think infringements upon or restrictions are legitimate? And that is a better way to put it. I think that the heart of this conversation, going right back to the top with Nicholas, was, I think the central question is, how do democratic governments efficaciously fight the virus without undermining human rights? And so the how is really the heart of it. And Brian also said that in the context of security crises, public health crises, we know that the balance can shift between protecting safety and civil liberties. So it's not necessarily that your rights are being violated. It's a question of whether you're doing human rights-based analysis to justify infringements. And for me, that's the linchpin. I'm gonna also, I just have to reference that beyond the basic challenge of efficacy in fighting the battle and adhering to human rights principles, I think democratic governments are really struggling on a couple of other fronts with this current context that I have to mention. One is the geopolitical narrative battle, where we see a general erosion of confidence in democracy as a form of government. Part of that is due to the inept response by the United States at the federal level. I think everybody's aware of that. I would add that I think that the Chinese government is absolutely stepping into the void of leadership and trying to push a narrative about an alternative approach to governance, the Chinese model, or a more authoritarian model that is appropriate in this context, all of which is aimed at undermining the post-World War II liberal democratic order, of which human rights framework is a big part. And so I will go back to, I guess, Nicholas, you talked about, there is a democratic approach to security threats and even surveillance. There's an authoritarian approach, and then there's the risk that fragile governments won't adhere to basic human rights principles. I am worried about an unconscious drift among human rights respecting democratic strong governments because they're not adequately paying attention to the basic process principles of necessity, proportionality, legality, and articulating how they're applying those to various policies, practices, new laws. And let me just throw in, I have to say, there's one, to the optimistic view, one piece of good news is that everybody is on the same page, I think. Civil society, governments, private sector. This is a real threat. It is a legitimate thing to fight the virus, and we have to be efficacious. The unfortunate thing for democratic governments, and the hard part, is how do you do that efficaciously and take that responsibility to articulate to your public application of a human rights framework on necessity, proportionality, legality, etc. That to me is the linchpin of this whole thing. And failure to do it is a big part of the problem, where we lead toward this unconscious drift toward digital authoritarianism. If democratic governments do it, that's how we reinforce the democratic model of government. You're on mute.
Clara, you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. That's an excellent point to introduce our second speaker for this third session. So let me introduce Adam Schwartz. He's a senior staff attorney at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for joining us, Adam. Perfect, now we can hear you. So let me just jump right in there and ask a very provocative question. So some people argue that privacy concerns in the midst of a global crisis are maybe a little overblown and that we need to compromise on our personal freedom, at least to some degree, in order to contain the spread of the virus, especially now in Europe. So why uphold privacy rights in times of crisis?
The reason we uphold privacy rights in times of crisis is that what we see when we look back on the crises of the past is that new surveillance systems that were adopted during the crisis stick around when the crisis ends. So for example, within months of the 9/11 terror attacks, the US government built a system of NSA dragnet internet surveillance, which we still have with us 20 years later. And so groups like the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, when we are seeing demands by government for new surveillance in times of a crisis, we have a three-part test. The first question is whether or not what the government is proposing has been shown by the government to be effective. And often the answer is no. So for example, proposals to use location tracking through the phone and cell site location information and GPS as a means of doing contact tracing has not been shown to be effective because it simply is not granular enough to show whether or not one person was adjacent to another person to a 2-meter point. Assuming that it might be effective, we advance to the next question, which is whether or not the burden on our freedoms, our privacy, our willingness to participate in free speech, the inevitable disparate impact on vulnerable groups like immigrants and people of color, whether it simply is intolerable. And so we've seen demands for face surveillance in public places to identify people who ought to be under quarantine. And we view that as simply intolerable. We think we should not be building up an infrastructure of face surveillance. Technology is both effective and within the reasonable impacts on our freedoms. We advance to our third question, which is whether or not the safeguards are sufficient. So for example, plans to use aggregation of location data so that we can see whether our people are moving around more than they should be, or make predictions of whether or not the disease is going to spread in one direction or another. Those might be effective and tolerable, but need all kinds of safeguards. And of course, the hardest question that everyone is struggling with is the proximity-based apps that use Bluetooth to be part of a proximity or a contact tracing system. At EFF, we think that such a system would only be effective if we have the major tools in place, which are widespread testing and lots of manual interview-based contact tracing of the kind that we've had for 150 years, as described by our first speaker with the London pump handle situation. At best, a proximity app is going to be an ancillary assistant to that process. Tech is not going to save us. There's no way we can nerd our way out of this crisis with the magic silver bullet app. Even if such an app is going to be effective, there need to be fundamental safeguards like voluntariness. No one should be forced to use it. No one should lose access to their job or a public place or anything if they don't use it. We strongly oppose the Singapore approach to contact tracing with their system, where once you report as ill, the government gets the information and the government's own. There needs to be all kinds of penetration testing and data security. We're talking about rolling out a massive, brand new, complex app on an emergency basis. It's going to be very buggy. So we need open source code so that all of the independent security researchers can identify problems.
Okay.
So the core takeaways, it might help a bit, but it's not going to save us.
Okay. Martin, take it away.
In the previous session, we talked a lot about the issue and the role of trust being very, very important. Now, if we look at what governments can do and what the private sector can do, and of course in this crisis, very often they work very closely together. What can they do other than just safeguarding and making applications more efficient and effective? What can they do to gain citizens' trust that their rights are not undermined?
So I'll jump in there. I think that's a great question. First point is I don't disagree with the EFF three-part test at all. To me, that is it's very parallel essentially to the necessary and proportionate standard of efficacy, the burden on civil liberties. And I will note on the question of trust, the governments, the democracies that have been most effective in combating the virus have been so because their public trusts them. And so efficacy and trust definitely go together. But the third point is, here's what's generally missing is articulation of application of that three-part test of EFF or the necessary and proportionate principles. That's how you build trust. And the lack of transparency in the apps that's being used, the data that's being gathered, the relationship between the private sector and governments, it may be helping efficaciously fight the virus, but it is undermining trust if you fail to articulate the application of a human rights framework. And so that is what I would underscore of the responsibility of democratic governments.
Adam, would you like to comment on the issue of trust?
Yes, I completely agree with Eileen that what EFF is describing is very much part of the necessary and proportionate framework, which we are big supporters of. And yes, nothing is going to be effective if there is not trust between the members of the society and the government who's leading the public health response. We believe that when the government becomes coercive and, for example, requires people to have these apps and requires people to share their private health information with the apps, that undermines trust. And we don't want a situation where people are leaving their phones at home or turning off the Bluetooth connection because they're afraid of the surveillance, because that would make the system less widely used. And we think those kinds of results are a very predictable result of the government taking a too heavy-handed approach. So if you want effectiveness, you need trust. And if you want trust, you need voluntariness and transparency.
If we look a little bit into the future, and so many political leaders, pundits, thinkers, intellectuals even say that this is such a profound disruptive crisis that it's really changing our ways of life. And we don't really yet understand how and in what way. One of the things, of course, then we have to look at, if it really changes so much our way of life, will it also change our values? Will it change our tolerance or perception of things like fundamental rights as well? So if we look at that, what is your outlook? Not only how should it be, but what is your expectation of the post-corona world once the crisis is over?
So, I unfortunately think that the crisis will be here for a long time. I share the concern that the emergency laws will never be lifted. Similar to what Adam said about post 9/11, even in the United States, many infringing practices have not been lifted. So that's a practical reality that is not unlikely. I am trying to be optimistic, and the one point that I would say is that democratic governments, let's just take the United States, I think that the geopolitical dynamics will get their attention and force them to recognize if they don't want to be displaced from some mantle of leadership, and this is true of democratic governments generally and the Democratic Alliance, if they don't want to be displaced and have the model of government go in the dustbin of history. They have to step up to the plate and defend the framework. And that can only happen if they adhere to it and they are transparent and responsible in articulating it to the public.
Adam?
I mean, I think everyone understands that in a pandemic like the one we're in now, that our lives are going to be different during the pandemic. And so half the world is under some form of shelter in place, instruction right now. I also think that people need to be cautious about the notion that they need to surrender privacy and submit to surveillance as the way to get out of this situation. When so many of the ideas that are coming down from governments have not been shown by those governments to be effective. And I think so far there is much to be said for approaches that are voluntary, that are explained by the public. I think that the use of aggregate data, I think the use of proximity apps might be within the range of things that could work, but people should be very skeptical of things like more surveillance cameras and more location tracking on an individualized basis, and any kind of coercive system of oversight.
Well, thank you. That pretty much sums it up. I think we can end this open salon on this final note. Thank you so much for your excellent comments. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Adam, for joining us. Thank you also to the rest of our excellent panelists. Thank you, Nicholas and Brian and Andy, Michael and Paul. This was the second edition of our open salon. So maybe some final words on what comes next in 2 weeks, right?
Absolutely. So we're going to continue this series, and maybe also a word of thanks to all our participants who participated actively in this salon. Next salon will be about cybersecurity, another of those topics that have been heavily influenced, affected by the current crisis. So that will happen in 2 weeks on May 1st, open salon on cybersecurity. So please, once
tune in,
invite, register for our second salon.
All right. It was a pleasure to have all of you, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you for joining.
Bye-bye.